Have you ever found yourself on a hot summer day, you've worked hard or you've played really hard and you're wrung out? You really need something to drink. Well, today we're going to be making a 1,000-year-old energy drink that was popular in the 18th century. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So, we really don't do drinks very frequently here on the show, but we do plan on doing a series on drinks here in the future. Today, the drink we will be making is called Switchel. According to the Oxford Companion for American Food and Drink, Switchel is a New England invention. But others say that Switchel actually came from the Caribbean to North America. Well, probably more likely it turns out that Switchel is just related to a number of very similar drinks that have been used or made for 1,000 years in various cultures around the globe. Switchel also goes by the name of Sitchel, Aquaforte, Ginger Punch, Yankee Beverage, and Swizzle. This drink is high in potassium. That's an electrolyte the body needs, especially when you've perspired a lot. And this drink was used for exhausted field hands and sailors alike. Most recipes for Switchel are found in mid-19th century cookbooks, but it's firmly rooted in 18th century references also. You can even find very similar drinks used by Roman soldiers to refresh themselves, and the ancient Greeks had a very similar drink that was called oxymel. This invigorating tonic can be made in several different ways, and it's very easy to put together. The recipe we're using today is from a mid-19th century cookbook called The Skillful Housewife. I'll start with a half a gallon of clean drinking water. To this I'll add a half a cup of unsulfured molasses, a quarter cup of apple cider vinegar, and a heaping tablespoonful of powdered ginger. Now stir this really well. Be sure to use a Barbados molasses or a light molasses, and definitely not a blackstrap molasses. That'll be much too bitter. Some of the recipes actually call for the use of maple sugar or maple syrup instead, and some of those references to molasses actually mean maple syrup. Honey makes another great alternative. That Roman drink, that was be made with honey instead of with molasses. Instead of or in addition to the vinegar, you can use a lemon juice or lime juice, and that'll make a very interesting variation. Instead of the powdered ginger, you could use a fresh ginger that's finely minced. But powdered ginger was a much more common way to find ginger in the 18th century. Ginger was one of the most common and one of the most inexpensive spices available at the time. Another great variation to this would be to add your daily rum ration right to this drink. That would make a great version of this. A closely related drink is a popular concoction called shrub. It was various fruit juices, something like that of raspberries or blackberries, sweetened how you pleased and added to vinegar. We offer a book at James Townsend & Son called Libations of the 18th Century. This does have recipes for Switchel as well as many other popular drinks of the time. So many times this drink was placed in a jug and suspended down into a well or placed in a running stream of water to cool it off. But we've all found that when we drink cool things on a hot day, it can upset our stomachs. That's one of the reasons why we believe that they had added ginger to this drink. Well, let's give this a try. It looks good. It still has the smell of vinegar, but not very strongly. Vinegar is about the last thing I ever want to eat or drink. But this, actually, it reminds me a lot of a good apple cider. It's very good. I can see why this would be a very, very popular drink, especially in hot weather. In our last episode of 18th Century Cooking, we did a carrot pudding. It was a bit more like a bread pudding. Today we're doing a second bread pudding out of Amelia Simmons's cookbook, but this one's more like, say, a carrot custard. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend & Son. So let's look at this Amelia Simmons recipe. It's very short and simple, and she leaves some stuff out, but here it goes. Carrot pudding, a cup full of boiled and strained carrots, 5 eggs, 2 ounces of sugar and butter each, cinnamon and rose water to your taste. Bake in a deep dish without a paste. Very, very simple. So let's get started. We need about a cup of boiled and mashed carrots. The next thing we need are 5 eggs. I whisked these up nicely. Now we need butter. We need 2 ounces of butter and 2 ounces of sugar. To this we're going to add cinnamon, let's say a teaspoon of cinnamon, just cinnamon to taste, we'll say. The recipe calls for rose water. You know, I really don't care for the kind of aroma that rose water gives off in the recipes. It's very common in 18th century recipes, but I haven't acquired the taste yet, so I'm going to leave the rose water out. She recommends baking this in a deep dish. The amount that this makes is just perfect for our little tin bowl. Make sure you pre-butter it before you pour this mixture in. She didn't give a baking time for this. I baked mine for about an hour. It might take even a little bit more, but so you're just gonna have to watch it. Go ahead and bake it at 350 degrees. So this pudding's definitely very different than the last one. I can't wait to find out just how different it tastes. And it's definitely a good bit eggier instead of bready. The sweetness is definitely there. The cinnamon is nice. This is really, really good stuff. And the carrot adds a good bit of flavor, but it doesn't have any kind of, you know, nasty carrotiness. When I was a kid, I really didn't care for carrots very much, but this is really, really good. Today I will be preparing a forced or a farced cabbage. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Today's recipe comes from the 1747 second edition of Primitive Cookery. Now, the Primitive Cookery that we sell in our catalog is the first edition. Unfortunately, this recipe is not in the one we carry, but this recipe in the cookbook is called, actually it's called a cabbage pudding. But many times, making the dish in the manner that we're going to make it in is also referred to as a forced or sometimes a farced cabbage. So let's get started. So let's start out with our cabbage here. We need to use about half the cabbage, but we also need to save some really big outer leaves to use when we're putting this together. So I'm going to cut this at the bottom to release some of these outer leaves. And they don't have to be perfect, but try to pick nice good ones that don't have any nastiness from the outside. You might want to take the very outer ones off if they're dirty. So you want enough leaves to make a full sort of cabbage head when we're done. So I need at least 2 good half leaves. We're going to save those back, and now we're just going to cut this cabbage in half and then chop it up nice and finely. I've got our lightly boiled cabbage here, or just scalded. I'm going to add it to the pot here. This recipe calls for 1 pound of chopped up veal. Today I'm using just a ground beef, a very lean ground beef. The recipe calls for an equal amount of shredded suet. I'm actually going to lower the quantity of suet in this recipe and use just a half a pound of shredded suet. We are now offering a beef suet on our website and in the future in our print catalog. It's USDA, made in the United States, grass-fed beef, suet, so it's really, really good stuff. Now let's spice this. The recipe calls for mace, nutmeg, salt, and pepper. And finally, it also in the spice section talks about green gooseberries, green grapes, or barberries in season. None of those are in season. It says if you're making this in the winter, you can also add some verjuice or in this case, since verjuice is a little hard to come by these days, you can get it online, but today I'm going to add a little bit of just plain apple cider vinegar, maybe 2 tablespoonfuls. And our final ingredient here, 3 egg yolks. You'll want to let your boiled cabbage cool down a little bit so it doesn't melt the shredded suet in your mixture. So this looks like enough to make 2 small boiled cabbage farces or 1 rather large one. I'm going to do a medium to smaller size one here, so it'll probably make enough for 2. And we're going to fill this leaf up with our mixture. The size is going to make a difference in the boiling time. There's our mount here. We're going to take a cabbage leaf and cover the top of it. If you've got some holes, you can use a second leaf here to finish up the looks of it. Now we need to put this in a pudding cloth. And that's one of the new products we've got here at James Townsend & Son. We took our natural linen fabric. We took about a 26-inch square or so, and we've got it hemmed up on all the sides, and it makes a perfect pudding cloth or a towel in the kitchen or at your campsite. This pudding or this boiled cabbage is not going to grow, so you can tie it fairly tightly. Like all boiled puddings, you want this to go into the water that's already boiling, and this is going to boil probably one this size, about an hour, maybe an hour and a quarter. So let's get this into boil. Wow, this looks great. Let's cut into this and try it out. You definitely want to eat this while it's warm if you've got the suet in it, because that kind of solidifies if it's cold. The cabbage is great. It's cooked and it's nice and tender. The spices, even the nutmeg, is something you ought to try in a recipe like this. Very interesting, and that vinegar really helps bring the flavor out. This is a great recipe. You need to try it. In today's episode, we're making a simple sack posset, or what we might call today a wine custard. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend & Son. A couple of weeks ago, I did an 18th century drink called Switchel. Well, the posset we're doing today is also classed sometimes as a drink in the 18th century. Let's talk about exactly what a posset is. A posset, at least by the mid to late 18th century, was a thick, custardy-like drink or dish that was made with ale or wine. Now, it's very closely related to a caudle, which is generally an earlier dish that's very similar, or a syllabub, which are usually drank cold, but possets are drank warm. Now, by the late 18th century, they were mostly a dessert kind of a thing, or sometimes something for an invalid or sick person to drink. Recipes for possets are generally found in 17th and 18th century cookbooks. By the early 19th century, they're disappearing, and you really don't see them anymore. But they do appear in most of the 18th century cookbooks. There's a very simple one here in Primitive Cookery. Today, the recipe I'm going to be using is actually sort of a meld between 2 recipes in Hannah Glass's 1747, The Art of Cookery. To start this recipe off, we need 1 pint of milk, and let's put it on to boil. As our milk comes to a boil, we need to make sure to keep stirring it. This is very easy to burn, so we don't want our milk to burn. Let's keep stirring that up, and now that it's nice and warm, it's time to add breadcrumbs to our milk. This depends exactly on how thick you want the mix to be. Let's say a half a cup of white breadcrumbs. Okay, our mixture is thick and dried up, and it's doing just a tiny bit of boiling. I'm going to take this off the fire. Now it's time to get the wine mixture started. I've got 2 egg yolks. I'm gonna get these beat up real quick. Some of these recipes call for if there are any eggs to actually be strained out. So you want to make sure they're whisked well. Now let's add in a half of a cup of sack wine. Now, sack wine is not something you can find anymore. Nobody calls wine sack. So what we're going to use is sherry, which is the closest modern equivalent. I'm using a nice dry sherry. Now let's add in some sugar. This is probably about a half a cup or so. That is definitely a to-taste situation, depending on how much sugar you want. And we're going to add in some nutmeg, maybe a fairly small quantity. We don't need a lot of nutmeg to overpower this. This looks good. Let's bring back in our milk. Let's get this stirred up a little bit. They do say to keep a lid on this so that it doesn't form a skin. Now let's just stir our wine and eggs into this and keep stirring it the whole time. We don't want this to separate up and get too curdy. It's a little thinner now with that mix into it, but you can see the kind of consistency. Let's go ahead and put these up into the dishes we're going to serve them in. To finish this off, for just a slight little bit of garnish, we're going to sprinkle a little bit of cinnamon up on top. A nice warm dish for a cold day like it is today. Let's go ahead and give this a try. This is really good. It is almost like a modern a pudding or a custard. It's very quick and easy to make. It's very simple. Not very many ingredients, and it's very tasty. It does have a bit of a strong wine flavor depending on what sherry you use, and that might be a little more than what some people like. There are some alterations we could try with this, especially if you wanted to do a non-alcoholic version. You could try substituting apple cider instead of the wine, or there's another suggestion that I did try, which is a mixture of lemon juice and orange juice, and the same quantity that you would put in instead of the wine, and it made a very interesting sort of a dessert custardy idea. And then I tried a little bit of mixing the two, and that really turned out very interesting. So I would suggest if you want to try to bring that wine flavor down a little bit, add just a little bit, maybe say an eighth of a cup of lemon juice to this, and I think you'll find that flavor comes right out. This is a great and wonderful, a nice warm dish, especially for a cold time of year like it is right now. I hope you get a chance to give it a try. Thanks for watching. In today's episode, we're making an 18th century pasta, which Hannah Glass calls vermicelli. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Pasta was not a common dish in 18th century England or in America, but it was introduced into the market in the late 17th century, and it shows up in cookbooks as one thing, as vermicelli. Hannah Glass in her 1770 cookbook references vermicelli maybe a half a dozen times. The most interesting recipe is the one in the very back, where she says how to make vermicelli. She apparently wasn't very happy with the imported version, so she gives a recipe for a very simple egg noodle, and that's what we're going to be making today. We're going to start off with a fairly small batch here. Hannah Glass's recipe is simplicity indeed. It is nothing but, it says simply, mix egg yolks with some flour. Started off with about a cup of flour, and to that added 6 well-beaten egg yolks. Let's work this out a little bit. So So there's our very simple dough. Just work it up into a stiff paste. Now the recipe calls for rolling this out as thin as possible. Hannah Glass calls for this to be dried in the sun, and then she says to cut it into our as thin as possible little strips. Well, you know, I didn't have much luck with letting this dry and then cutting it. Possibly letting it get to a leather hard state and then cutting it might work, but it works just fine to cut it while it's still damp like this. This is very stiff, so it's fairly easy to cut. So she calls to have this cut as thin as possible. I've got these cut up. Let's put them out on a sheet to dry. We do have these new baking sheets at James Townsend and Son. These are standard tin and formed up in shape like baking sheets were pictured in Diderot's encyclopedia. So if you're looking for a nice small baking sheet, an 18th century design, we've got these available now. So let's just sprinkle these out on the sheets, separate them so that they can dry up. And I just cut these into a short, easy to store design, fairly short, like vermicelli is sold today. Hannah Glass says if you want to speed up the process and use these right away, you can slowly dry these in the oven or set them by the fire, as she says, and they'll dry in 15 or 20 minutes. Mine took a good bit longer. I just set mine in my modern oven with it off, and the pilot light was enough to dry these out overnight. I know I'm going to get a question about a gluten-free version of this, and of course you can try this out with something like oat flour or maybe rice flour if you want to make your own sort of 18th century vermicelli without using wheat. So in the next couple of episodes we're going to be using these vermicelli noodles in several different recipes. Thanks for watching today. So today I'm joined by Michael Dragoo. Michael, do you remember the vermicelli episode I did? So a viewer asked, did they use the vermicelli without drying it? And I said originally no, that they didn't. But then I ran into this recipe just the other day. And I said, hey, that looks exactly like pasta, but that isn't dried yet. So we're making this one today. This one starts out very simple. It says to break an egg into as much flour as will make a stiff paste. So this is just one egg into some flour. And you go ahead and it says mix it up into a stiff paste, and then we're going to slice it. But first, let's just mix that up. Yep. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery. It's probably from the 1747 edition. It also shows up in Eliza Smith's cookbook that's even earlier. So this is a good mid 18th century recipe. Okay, so now that we've got our stiff paste, we can roll this out. Go ahead and set that there. And roll that out nice and thin. Now, the recipe says that we want to roll it out and then slice it as small as you would slice herbs. And then she says to chop it again as small as you could sift in a sifter. So she wants very fine bits of this pasta. Okay. That looks good, Michael. That's chopped up nice and fine. Go ahead and transfer it into the bowl.
You know what it looks like? It looks like couscous.
Yes, very similar. And I've got this, this has already been scalded, preheated. Yep. We can go ahead and add, let's see, I've got some sugar here, maybe 1/3 of a cup. Let's put in a little bit of cinnamon, which the recipe calls for. Go ahead, a nice healthy pinch of salt.
Okay.
And I've got butter here. It says butter.
A walnut.
The butter the size of a walnut.
Yeah.
Go ahead and add in our pasta, and then I'll take this over the fire.
All right.
So as you can see, she said cook it until it gets as thick as you like. So it's a nice little thickness. It took a little bit of time, but make sure to stir this all the time that you're cooking it. You don't want it to burn.
Okay, here we go.
Good. There we go, and there's that.
Yay.
Now she says to put a little butter up on top, and I'm going to go ahead and garnish with an extra little bit of cinnamon, just for a pretty look. Go ahead and give it a try, Michael.
Alrighty.
Give that a try.
I'm going to try. Oh, it's a tasty hasty pudding. It's like custardy kind of an oatmeal thing.
It's like oatmeal.
Huh.
And
it's good.
Depending on if you let it cool down a little bit more, you get something that's almost like tapioca pudding.
Okay. I don't know that's pasta. I don't know that.
Right.
It doesn't taste like it at all.
You wouldn't recognize it as that. And it's so rich and creamy. Look at that.
No.
It's great.
So we went straight from making it to rolling it out. We didn't let it dry at all.
Nope. And
this is good. I like this.
It's got a wonderful, great consistency. Nice and flavorful. You could add a little bit more sugar if you needed that. But it's good just like this.
Yeah,
If you get a chance to try out this hasty pudding, you will love it. I want to thank you for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I'm going to try more of this. In the last couple of episodes, we made vermicelli and vermicelli soup. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. It's called a vermicelli pudding. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So the vast majority of 18th century English cookbooks that have vermicelli recipes, they're all very similar to last week's. They make a very thin, kind of a brothy soup, and they have the noodles down in there with a little bit of bread. But this recipe is, well, it's in the pudding section, and it's completely different. So let's get started. This recipe starts off with a pint of new milk. We're going to boil our 4 ounces of vermicelli in this milk. And as with all milk boiling situations, we need to keep this stirring the whole time. All we need to do is boil this until it's soft, so it won't take very long. Our stuff is really thickened up. Let's add in the rest of our ingredients. She calls for some cinnamon. I'm just going to add some already pre-ground cinnamon for a little bit of flavor. The next item here is a cup of heavy cream. I know you're thinking, this is sounding good already, right? Now, you can't have cream, of course, without 4 ounces of melted butter. After the butter and cream, we're going to use the same quantity of sugar, about 4 ounces of granulated sugar. And the last item in the recipe is 4 egg yolks well beaten. Let's get this stirred up. Now let's pour this into a dish. She says bake it in a dish without a paste. So we can just pour it straight into this nice redware pie pan. This should fill up your pie pan pretty well. You probably don't want it to get too full. This one might even be just a little bit more full than I want because it's going to do a little bit of growing as it's cooking, and then it'll come back down. You want to bake this about an hour in a modern oven at approximately 350 degrees. Well, this one baked an hour and I've let it cool off. Let's give it a try. It looks great. It smells good too. And hey, it's so rich. How could it be bad? It's probably one of the best ever recipes that we've done. I mean, if you've watched this episode, you might have recognized this, maybe in a term that we're more likely to recognize it as kugel, which is a Jewish noodle pudding. Well, this is almost exactly the same kind of recipe. It is so rich. It is so wonderful. You know, it's got sugar in it, but it's not so sweet that it really overwhelms you. But the rest of the ingredients really give it a very wonderful, rich flavor. And if you make it with your very own fresh noodles, wow, this is excellent. I really, really suggest anybody give this recipe a try. Thanks so much for watching. Bone broth has really had a modern resurgence, especially in the last couple decades, and very recently it's gotten very popular. But bone broth has a very rich and deep history from the Middle Ages, and especially very versatile and used in so many dishes in the 18th century. So first, let's talk about what we're covering here, bone broth, especially its modern interpretation. Bone broth is a meat and bone combination, usually a sort of a difficult to use cut or a leftover, like a chicken carcass or something like that. It's cooked for a very long period of time at a fairly low temperature, something just right around boiling or a little bit lower. And usually spiced and has some other things like onion in it, and used for soups and broths, and it's very valued for its nutrition that it carries along with it, as well as its frugality. So there's so many different recipes I could pull out of 18th century cookbooks to give you an example of bone broth. The one we're using today is from Elizabeth Cleland's New and Easy Method of Cookery from 1755. This recipe she calls a rich broth. We're going to start off with 3 pounds of a beef houk, and that is a Scottish term for a cut of meat that today we call a shank. In some 18th century cookbooks, it might be called also a shin, a beef shin. And they might even refer to it as a skink. Some of these terms are very kind of confusing. Similar recipes also call for other difficult to use cuts of meat, like the scrag end. If you see a scrag end, that means the neck. And you'll see like beef neck used in this, sometimes mutton neck. But all these are the same thing. Very difficult to use cuts of meat. The shank here has got lots of connective tissue. It's a hard-working muscle, so it's very, very tough and difficult to cook in any other way. So many, many times I used it in a broth. This one's so simple. We've got our 3 pounds of meat with the bone in. We also have good clean water, and we've got salt in this recipe, and we've got some spices, and they vary depending on the recipe. This one's got pepper, it's got allspice in it, and some mace. Most of the 18th century cooking methods really fall into 2 camps. Either you can take your pot and put this in it and cook it over a low fire for 4 to 6 or sometimes as much as 12 hours, tending the fire all the time, keeping it on a low simmer. Or at times they put this in a cooking pot and slid it into the oven and had it bake for a long period of time, probably even overnight, so that this would cook down. Now we could certainly do this on the stovetop, but we're going to do this the easy way today. We're going to use a slow cooker. Most of the 18th century recipes really didn't talk too much about how long to cook this, at least in time-wise. They really referenced what's happening to the meat that's in the dish. They say things like cook it until it turns to rags, or until all the goodness is out of the meat. So let's get started with getting this cooking. Normally we just put our meat down in the bottom of our dish. Now let's add our spices. We've got our salt first and our other spices. We're going to pretty much fill this up, and we're going to put this on low. We're going to let this cook a good long time. You can cooking overnight is great, or you can set this to start cooking before you go to work, and it'll probably be done when you get back. You can let this cook even longer if you really want to. 12 hours, 24 hours even, to really extract everything out of the meat and the bones. And this smells great. The meat is nice and tender. This does a great job releases all those great nutrients. This is wonderful. The recipe calls for removing the meat, remove the bones, and strain this off so that you take out all the shreds of meat. So there's so much we can do with these items now that we've got them to this state. The meat that's left over here, this is perfect for potting. This potted meat is very common in the 18th century. They'd take the meat that was very cooked like this. They'd chop it up, mince it up. They would grind it in a mortar and pestle even, so that they would make it very, very fine. Then mix it with clarified butter. And then they would actually put it in a pot, like our canister here, and then cover it over with clarified butter. And that clarified butter would stay liquid, and you could store that for a great period of time. When you wanted to eat some of that, you could just dip it out with a spoon and use it as a spread or something else. And the clarified butter would seal right back over the top of that, and you would be able to take out servings as you go. The broth here is the basis for so many dishes. Most of the soups are going to use a broth like this. You'd also use this broth as a basis for a ragu. So it's used in so many of the dishes. When this is completely cool, it'll be very easy to remove all the fat off the top of this broth. If you strain this broth through a cloth and then gently simmer that and reduce it and continue to reduce it, you'll end up with a very thick gelatin, which is the precursor to a portable soup, which we'll probably cover in a future episode. Last week I showed you how to make a strong broth, or as we might know it, a bone broth. Today we're going to take that broth and make an asparagus soup that is so delicious. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. This asparagus soup recipe is from Elizabeth Cleland's A New and Easy Method of Cookery from 1755. Let's get started. The recipe calls for greening up your beef broth with the juice of spinach. And in the 18th century, you would take your spinach here and we would smash it around until we crush it into a paste. But that's an awful lot of work. In a modern kitchen, if you've got a juicer, it's child's play. If you don't have a juicer, then you can add a little bit of water to your spinach and use your blender and whir it up into a thick slurry here. And now we can just take and strain that slurry off. You can pour your puree into your jelly bag. Spinach juice like this is used in many different 18th century recipes to color things green. Let's just add that to our broth. Let's put this onto a quick boil. After this is boiling, we add asparagus chopped up in half-inch segments. I've got an onion that's got some cloves stuck in it. We've got some mace, some black pepper, and a little bit of allspice, along with some sweet herbs. And finally, just a little bit of salt to taste. This is a great spring dish, and you could substitute your asparagus with some other things. You could put cabbage in this, like a spring lettuce, or even stinging nettles would be great in this. Just before you serve this up, make sure to remove the onion and the sweet herbs. Once this is boiling, it's time to thicken it, and we're going to thicken it with a simple roux. Roux were very common in the 18th century for thickening. They weren't technically called roux. This one's very simple. It's made with a stick of butter and a half a cup of flour, and I made this ahead of time last night, and I let it cool so it would be easy to use today. The recipe says it needs to boil a little while after you've added your roux. It's so rich and creamy, and it smells great. Let's give it a try. That's excellent. The asparagus has a great, wonderful flavor. Hasn't been boiled too long, so it's still got a little bit of tooth to it. It's got a fantastic flavor. This is a great spring soup. You really must try this. I want to thank you for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Today we're going to be making historic donuts. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. I'm joined today by Michael Dragoo. You've seen him in some of the past episodes where we did Scott's eggs and some other things. Where does this recipe come from, Michael?
First reference in this country to donuts is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, 1805 edition.
Right, in the 1805 edition, that's the one with all the addition of the American recipes. That's the first one where they add in donuts, corn, cranberries, I think. Lots of interesting variations of the English recipes into sort of an American form. Is 1805 the first time that donuts were called donuts that we know of?
1803, 1805, there's a couple of cookbooks that are referring to dough nuts, 2 words.
2 words?
Yep, it's a coming from Europe, it's a Dutch kind of a thing, but the first time it's called donuts is in these cookbooks.
There are earlier recipes that talk about nuts, ginger nuts, pepper nuts. Those were baked little kind of cookie things.
A hard exterior with a soft,
Right, but I think because of the shape and what's going on here, that's where the name probably comes from.
Yep.
But these were made with sort of like a bread dough, so they're called doughnuts instead, and cooked in hot oil, deep fat fried.
Yep.
So these seem to be related to the oliekoeken, which is a Dutch dish. They also are very similar to English fritters. So let's get started on this recipe. Michael, what have we got for ingredients?
It's a pretty loose recipe. We've got 3.5 to 4 cups of flour.
Right.
We've got half a cup of sugar.
Okay.
And we've got a teaspoon of salt.
Good.
And we've got, it called for 2 spoonfuls of yeast. And at the time...
They would have used barm. Today we're using instant yeast in this because we can add that directly here. If you want to research that barm, we've got a video where we deal with barm specifically. We'll put a link right here in the video so that you can look at that.
You don't want to overwork this, but it's just real light. And then we've got a cup to a cup and a half of warmed milk. We've got a half a cup of butter. It's not very hot. Just we don't want to kill the yeast, right? We're just going to mix that all up. And this should make a nice soft dough.
Let me clear off this table and we'll get some flour down so we can roll this out just very lightly. There you go.
I think we're all set here.
So we're not smushing this flat. We want to roll it out to about a 1/2 inch thick. Michael's going to cut these up into squares. The holes in donuts don't come till later on in the 19th century, something like the 1830s when holes show up in donuts. So we're just going to do a simple sort of square shapes.
These need to be small enough that they'll cook all the way through. And let them rise for a little bit.
Couple hours, maybe even if you're at home, you can let these rise overnight in the refrigerator. They should be either covered with plastic or cloth as they rise. So here are a few that we did last night. Your donuts may not rise a whole bunch because there's so much fat in this dough that they don't rise a bunch. But as we put them in the hot oil, they will spring right up, puff right up. So these look great. Your hot oil should be about 350 degrees. We're using lard here. Again, you can use any sort of deep frying oil that you'd like. You should fry these until they're a nice deep mahogany brown. While they're still hot, you can roll these in cinnamon sugar to finish them off. We've invited Ivy in to give these a try with a sample of these wonderful donuts. Go ahead and pick whichever your favorite one is there. I want a big one. Let's try this one. These are still warm right out of the oil.
Ooh. Oh, man. Such a simple recipe.
Yeah, the dough is so wonderful and soft when we cook them, and the flavor is great. The cinnamon sugar really sets these off, and they're right out of Hannah Glass's 1805 cookbook. Wonderful, wonderful. There's nothing better than campfire donuts. We're using the greens that we collected in our last video to make a wonderful springtime soup. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. It's such beautiful springtime weather out right now that I just had to get out of the kitchen, out of the house. You know, it's been a long winter, So we're going to be doing this soup with our springtime greens right out here in a camp setting. Let's get started with our soup. I'm going to put probably a quart of water here, maybe a little less. And let's get that started warming up. If you're going to be making your soup with a beef base or some kind of a meat base, especially say you're going to be using a salt ration, then you'll want to put your salt ration in here ahead of time when it's cold. If you're using a fresh beef ration, you want this water boiling when you put it in. For our portable soup that we're going to be using today, actually that goes in last, so we're not going to put the portable soup in yet. For this particular soup, the first thing that goes in is our barley. And let's put in just about a handful of barley here. And regular barley will take approximately an hour in your boiling water before you're ready to put in your other ingredients. You could also put in rice, steel cut groats, or something similar too. Springtime is the perfect time to get out and reconnect with nature and reconnect with your friends and your family in a cooking experience like this, or a spring camping time. It is a perfect time of year for that kind of thing. I really love this time of year because it's so much different than, say, summertime. You get a lot of the plants aren't up yet, but there are no mosquitoes, there's no ticks. We got migratory birds this time of year, so it's a totally different kind of experience. I've got stinging nettles, which is the bulk of what's going on here. And I'm going to chop them up fairly small. The stinging part of these stinging nettles, which is formic acid, goes away in the high temperature of the boiling. So we don't need to concern ourselves, worried about whether that's going to hurt us when we eat it. I've got a little bit of wild garlic. Yeah, I called this wild onions in the last video, but actually with this tubular stem, it's wild garlic. Wild garlic is strong enough that you probably don't want a lot of it in here. I'm just going to use some of the green stems. Chop them up fine. I even have a few of the bulbs that I cleaned off, and we'll just chop those up and put those into. Don't need very much of that. It's gonna bring a lot of flavor in with it. Along with our dandelion greens I've got here, I also have some of the garlic mustard. I'm not going to use a lot of that. You really should pre-taste some of these greens so that you know whether it's going to be something you really want to put a lot of or a little into your soup. If you've got it, carrots, parsnips, many things could go in at this point. So our greens and our barley are done. It's time to put in the portable soup. Here are our little portable soup pieces. And, we're using about a quart of water, maybe a little bit less. We're going to need maybe 3 or 4 pieces this kind of size. I'm going to toss it in there. Now, the thing about the portable soup in this recipe is that we don't want to cook this a lot after we put in the portable soup. As soon as the portable soup has dissolved, it's no longer in its little blocks, then your soup is done and it's time to take it off the fire. So I'm going to pay attention to this to make sure that I catch this as soon as it's basically dissolved. It only takes a few minutes, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 minutes for this stuff to break down. I know you're going to ask about a vegetarian version of this same soup. The perfect answer is mushroom ketchup powder. When you get done making your batch of mushroom ketchup, your leftover mushrooms, you let those dry out, and this is a spectacular flavor booster. It's got some salt in it. It's got wonderful flavors, and it's perfect for this. In fact, I think I'm going to cheat and put some in while no one's looking. It definitely is going to need some seasoning, so I've got our pocket spice kit. It's great for a little camping trip like this.
let's go ahead and put in some salt. And definitely some pepper. And of course I like pepper, so more the better. And maybe just give it a little extra zing. How about some cayenne? Also, if you want to thicken this up and you're on the trail, a little bit of ship's biscuit in here would be a great addition. Oh yeah, that's great. And the greens too. This is done. Our soup has cooled down and it looks great. It's really it's even thickened up a little bit. It's still rather warm, but the greens are in there. You can see the barley in there. It's got a nice color to it. Wow, that is excellent soup. There's nothing like cooking your meal out over an open fire like this with greens that you've just gathered, and it's wonderful flavor. Wow, nice tooth to it. The barley thickens it up nicely. A great flavor from the portable soup. Oh, and that portable soup, we're going to show you in our next episode, next Monday, just how you can make very easily, very simply, this portable soup at home.
Today I'm going to show you how to make portable soup. Portable soup was very popular in the 18th century for many good reasons. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So let's talk a little bit about what portable soup is. It's a very concentrated form of essence of meat, sort of like a solidified broth. And in the time period, they used it like we would use soup bouillon today. It goes by many different names in period texts. You'll see it as portable soup, portable broth, pocket soup, veal glue, I like this one, portmanteau pottage, and the list goes on and on. Portable soup was extremely convenient. It doesn't take up very much space. It's very light. It's a very condensed food source, and it's very flavorful in that very condensed form. It was used by military, by travelers, even used as an invalid food source at times, especially aboard ship. So it was used in many different situations. But it was very difficult to make, especially in a home setting. It took a long period of time to make. You have to watch it all the time, because if you turn your back on it and it got too hot, it would ruin all your work. So it was very laborious, and it was even industrialized in the 18th century. Even if you're not a historical reenactor yet, this portable soup makes an excellent homemade flavor booster that's all natural, and you can use it in sauces, soups, gravies, so it's great for that. Now, if you've watched our recent bone broth video, this recipe starts off exactly the same way. Now, you can do this over a slow open fire. You can do it on your stove top, or since you're probably doing this at home and you want to make this easy, I really suggest using a slow cooker. I'm using a medium-sized slow cooker that'll hold about 5 pounds of meat. If you want to make a larger batch, I suggest using a kitchen roaster. The meat I'm using is beef shank, similar to what we used in our bone broth video. Beef shank is a hard-working muscle, so it's a tough cut of meat. It has a lot of collagen in it, which makes it especially good for this recipe. Another good cut of beef would be the neck bone. Other cuts will work, but just not as well. Now, this can be done with poultry. You can boil that in water, and that will be the basis of this portable soup. So you can go ahead and place your meat in your slow cooker and cover it with water. Most of the recipes we've found suggested adding nothing else. Seasoning can come later when it's actually used as the portable soup. Some of the recipes suggest using only the meat. Other ones include the bones, and that's what we're doing in the recipe today. Turn your slow cooker on low and go about your business for the next 8 to 10 hours. Once the time has gone by, remove the meat. You can now pick it clean of the bones and any remaining gristle and fat. This is really good tasting beef. At this point, turn off your slow cooker and let it cool completely. As it cools, the fat on the top will solidify, making it very easy to remove. Once you're done with that, strain your broth and filter it through a piece of cloth to get out all the settlings. So go ahead and rinse out your slow cooker, return the clarified broth to it and turn it back on low. Let it go and leave the lid off. Let it cook for anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. What we're doing at this stage in the process is reducing the broth down to a gelatin. Gelatin is an interesting thing. Don't expect to be able to reduce this down into a hard block. What you end up with is a nice medium brown gluey substance. If you overcook it, you will burn it, giving it a very, very unpleasant taste. Once your soup reaches this stage, turn off your slow cooker and let it cool completely. Then you can turn the gel out onto a cloth. Now this soup is still very gelatinous. To get it to the point where you can store it, put it in your pocket, it needs to be dried. Now you cannot do this with heat. Any temperature of heat will just turn this into a liquid again, and then you'll just burn it. So it needs to be done without heat. You can do this in a dehydrator, but you need to make sure the dehydrator doesn't heat anything up. The period recipe actually suggests turning it out onto a woolen flannel cloth, just like we've done here, and flipping it over 2 or 3 times a day for 10 days or 2 weeks or so. If you want to speed this process up at home, put this on a cooling rack and put it in front of a fan, and it'll dry out in a couple of days. The end results will be a very stiff paste. It's almost like leather. You're going to cut this up into chunks and then wrap it up in paper or something similar to store it away. It'll continue to harden as it ages, but it's completely usable in this leathery hard form. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for watching.